And I wanted to get to that because we've mentioned a few times, of course, that really is really very much for so many of us in the community, but especially I think for you guys, it's very much a before and after kind of thing. I mean, that event changed everything for obviously the people that lost their homes, but for you and your organization as well, it really has changed the game in terms of what you can do and what your purpose is. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, it is. I think one of the ways that I've described it is we really transformed into a disaster relief organization overnight because we had to. Mm-hmm. This was not something that we prepared for or planned on doing, but what happened and was so obvious because of the scale of the disaster was that there was going to be a need for a neutral fiduciary, a neutral repository for donations. And what we were good at before the fire, I think really set the stage for this. And what we were good at before the fire was evaluating nonprofit organizations, working directly with them, helping support their capacity, making sure that the grants that our donors or our funds were directing to them were used in accordance with the grant and what they were meant to be doing. And so we had set a stage, I think, I hope, of credibility and some neutrality so that folks knew when we opened the doors to donations for the fire that in fact we were going to make sure that it went out and got exactly where it needed to go, and that we were going to monitor it. Mm-hmm. Again, we had no idea what the scale was. Mm-hmm. So at 8:30 in the morning, I remember seeing the smoke and calling my director of grants and saying, please open up a fund, like we had for many other fires, like we had for earthquakes on the other side of the globe. This is something we've done at the foundation for 8 or 9 years now. We open up a fund so that local community members can contribute, and then we find the right partner on the ground that's helping the most with the disaster. Well, we were that community foundation on the ground for the Camp Fire. There was no one to direct the money to initially, so we collected it. And within 3 days, we had already issued our first round of grants to every shelter that had opened their doors, whether it was a Red Cross shelter or just a makeshift shelter, a church, a martial arts studio, pretty much anybody that was opening their doors to our community members that were suffering. We wanted to make sure they had the funding they needed to do that. And then that first wave of support ended up lasting 3 months. Mm-hmm. We had people at the fairgrounds until 3 months after the fire. So.
Yeah. This fire has changed so much for so many people. It's changed, and of course the lives that were lost and the people's homes that were lost and all of that. And it's a human tragedy that we can't even really comprehend, those of us that luckily were safe with that. But it's also changed so much in terms of how people think about environmental concerns, the housing crisis, homelessness. I mean, so many of these issues. It's also really changed the way people think about giving, the act of giving, and opening up your home, opening up your office, opening up whatever you have to contribute, to do what you can to help. Do you think or let me ask in a different way, how have you seen that manifest itself with individuals and groups that want to give and are motivated to want to do that, an event like this? What does it do to motivate and change people's perspective on that?
Well, I think you nailed it in the former bit of the question, which is what the Camp Fire, I think, has done is highlight so many of the challenges that we had before the fire. So oftentimes I share with people, we had a major housing crisis before the fire. We had affordable housing issues before the fire. We had all of these challenges around ACE scores for our precious children, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma and mental health concerns prior to the Camp Fire. So I think you're right in articulating that all of that was brought to the surface when we see the magnitude of people suffering and putting that in a context of the communities down the hill where they ended up being. Not, of course, just them, but all of us. All of us have been impacted by this. And so the only appropriate response, I think, would be for masses to show up with open hearts and with the ability to act, literally to open their doors and to make sure that they were doing anything they could in any way they could to help. And that's what we saw. So I have been preaching human kindness and the inherent goodness of people for decades. This is just what I believe. And I'll tell you, the reaction to this fire was still surprising to me. Somebody that is constantly seeking out and trying to nurture and support that goodness, it was like, it was just evident and it was available, and nobody had to sit and talk about, like, do we open our doors to friends and family or strangers? It just happened. I think where we're at now, 4 months after, is looking at it from a slightly different perspective, which is, how now as a region do we come together? How as a people do we come together and really start putting a path or a map for real healing? Not, again, just for those that had to run down the hill to save their lives, but for all of us. All of us have experienced something here that was life-changing, you know? And so I think now that human kindness and that goodwill that surfaced really needs to move into some organized togetherness.
It always strikes me when you have a tragedy like this that, you know, there's this outpouring, there's this desire to do something and give money to open your home, whatever it may be. And it's like, well, why can't we do that all the time? I mean, there's people in need all the time. There's people right now that are starving all over the world. There's people in our region that are homeless. There are, you know, from the fire and before the fire. I mean, these are things that are going on all the time in our country and in the world. Why does it take something, it's just because it focuses attention? Why does it take that tragedy to make people finally realize, I've got to help?
Well, two things. I think there is a truth to the fact that we see it and we can experience it, and we are motivated by that, by our senses, literally, physically, by the ability to see that it's happening right here. So there is some truth to that. Just like I'm sure when you know, CNN and 24-hour news cycles started happening, we could see what was happening to our brothers and sisters after an earthquake. I'm sure there was reaction to that, the awareness, it being in our living room. But what I would say is, I don't think it took something like this to get us to respond. I think we have been responding. I think human beings, and here locally I can speak on behalf of them, have been doing good in their own ways to the things they care about, and it didn't take a tragedy to get them there. Oftentimes it was just simply being exposed to something or seeing something that they wanted to change in the world. But what you're experiencing and what we're experiencing is the masses about the same issue, which is what's happened to our region and what's happened to our brothers and sisters in Paradise and the Ridge. So you know, and that, again, that's just my worldview, because I have an opportunity to have built a business where people are rushing in my door day in and day out telling me the dreams in their hearts to make the world better. That is my worldview, because that's what I've been living.